Joel, we were talking earlier about the Last Supper as a Seder of sorts, which was quite historically possible, but we also noted that it doesn't really look a whole lot like what familiar Seders of the present day are. There's an interesting trajectory there. Can you start to tell us about how we begin to get from one to the other?
Sure. We have to sort of go all the way back to the biblical Passover, right? But again, two parts: had a sacrifice probably in the temple, and then some eating practices at home.
Right. So in fact, I said it's not very much like the Last Supper. It's also not very much like
exactly
the Passover meal of Exodus 12.
Right. So how did we get from a temple sacrifice and then abstaining from leaven in the house to the Seder we have today? The big shift, as was the case for virtually every Jewish practice, is the destruction of the temple in 70. Suddenly, there was no possibility of sacrifice because the place of sacrifice was gone. And what we think of as contemporary, or modern Judaism, by which I mean Judaism, going back basically 2,000 years, is almost entirely an attempt to figure out how to maintain the core of biblical ritual practice without the core place of and practice of biblical ritual practice. How do we do without sacrifice? And so, right, as I know you know, right, all of the Jewish liturgy, right, all the prayer services are intended to replicate the sacrificial service from the temple. There are 3 prayers per day in Judaism because there were 3 sacrifices per day. And the Seder was the attempt of the early rabbis in the first couple centuries after the destruction of the temple, as they were putting together what's called the Mishnah, the sort of first codification of Jewish law. It's their attempt to bring the Passover into a new post-temple world. So, okay, we can't sacrifice the lamb. We can, however, eat sort of a ritual meal akin to the ritual offering. And we can, instead of burning something, we can sort of represent it on our table symbolically. So already in Exodus 12, right, we had the lamb, we had bitter herbs, and we had unleavened bread as the 3 main parts of the meal, and those remain. Now, however, they're becoming symbolic. So, we are supposed to explain what they each represent. And so the practice goes from temple, right, that it would have been in the temple that the priests would have been performing the actions. Now we in our houses perform the actions. The priests would have been singing the songs. Singing psalms becomes part of the sort of ingrained part of the Seder.
But some of those actions turn into explanations, as it were. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So the elements are still there as physical things, but they sit on the Seder plate to be talked about.
That's absolutely right. It moves from a ritual practice meant to commemorate an event to a sort of a ritual retelling of the event to keep it sort of fresh in the mind. The Exodus was the absolute most important story for the Hebrew Bible and for Judaism, and the Passover sacrifice was the most important practice, right? It's Passover in the Bible. It's Passover and circumcision are the two ritual practices that are definitional for what it means to be one of the people.
So when does this process? Obviously, it begins in a sense definitively with the destruction of the temple. But by when do we start to get the sense that sort of different ritualization has come into being? Is that already there in the earliest rabbinic documents, for instance?
I think it is certainly. The practice of doing things that less in the temple and more in small communities, I think we can say certainly goes back even before the destruction, right? The rise of what we think of as rabbinic Judaism predates the destruction of the temple. So already the notion, sort of interpretation as an essential part of practice rather than simply ritual slaughter, right, is already there. But I think that in the earliest rabbinic materials, again, the Mishnah, right, 2nd century of the Common Era, though it gives us fairly ritualized things. The first thing it says is you must drink 4 cups of wine at this meal, right? That's it doesn't say why or what they represent. But again, as we've said before, they were trying to make this into an upper class Greco-Roman sort of feast, which is why it ends with the search for the existence of the afikomen, right? We use a Greek word still in Judaism for the dessert.
Yeah.
So they're trying to replicate this meal, but they're giving instructions. Or you have to drink this much wine, but then also, right, you must explain things, right? Is built into the text. There is speaking to children,
right,
about it, right, which is built on the biblical sort of sayings that. When your children ask you about this, you should tell them.
Yep.
Right? And that happens. There are 4 such times in the Hebrew Bible where that's said, and there are therefore 4 children represented in the. But there are many, many parts of the modern Seder that are later developments from that initial, the Mishnah that sort of gave us the backbone of it.
Is that just sort of a continuous process? Are there any other sort of crises or key moments where we see other things we're familiar with emerge?
It goes sort of in fits and starts. The Mishnah gave us the outlines of what we now call the Haggadah, right, which is sort of the script for the Passover Seder. It's not a Haggadah itself, but it becomes sort of the backbone of it. Judaism sort of has this dark period. There's the Talmud, which is 5th, 6th century commentary on the Mishnah, which doesn't give us a whole lot more in terms of the script, the Haggadah part. But by the 9th century, 10th century, we have something very, very close, actually, to what we currently have that was developed by the Jewish leaders and rabbis in Babylon, in modern-day Iraq. So we're getting the script. It's becoming fleshed out with the 4 sons, the 4 children, the 4 questions, the wine, and also commentary on the Mishnah, which all sort of becomes part. So stories about rabbis talking about the Passover during their own seders become part of the celebration of the Seder. So it's talking about, which I think only focuses the fact that what we're dealing with here is storytelling.
Yes. So there's a fairly organic development. One thing that strikes me is that we talked in an earlier conversation about how, in its origins, Passover seems to combine 2 traditions or ideas: the Passover proper, the lamb, and the unleavened bread. The practices around leaven actually seem to be remarkably stable in some respects, right?
Sure.
So getting rid of everything that's capable of turning into leaven is directly and universally observed, whether or not it requires explanation. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That one, because it has, because it's done in the home and can always be done in the home, it doesn't need to change. I am quite sure that most people, certainly today, have no idea why they're cleaning their home of leaven or how far back it goes.
Yes. I think another reason people don't understand that, I didn't understand it until I sort of started becoming more interested in actually making bread and realizing that the origins of leaven lie simply in the way wet flour ferments by itself.
Yeah.
I've made sourdough starters myself. I've made chametz. I've made leaven, not necessarily for any ritual purpose or lack thereof, but simply because this is what happens when you've got flour lying around. So when people go to extremes, as they might seem, to dismantle their ovens and sort of do all sorts of cleaning processes, it's actually related, of course, to how that works. And I think that those of us who think that bread comes from packages of yeast, probably not quite understand the basis of that.
Yeah. The continuity of the lack of leaven and simply the eating of unleavened bread, right? That one, especially because it's so rooted in the story, right? Everybody knows, right? I'm not eating leavened bread because the Israelites didn't have time to let their dough rise. It's, I think, at odds with the incredible variety of the rest of the Seder practice. One of the most interesting, I think, things that happens in the development of the Seder is the inclusion of different kinds of songs and singing. Right? There are psalms that are supposed to be recited that go very, very far back, all the way to the Mishnah.
Yep.
But by the 13th century, perhaps, we were already including what seem to be folk songs that have no connection with anything. There's the song Chad Gadya, which is the sort of Aramaic equivalent of "There was an old woman who swallowed a fly."
Right.
It has nothing to do with anything, but it's in there. And then the most recent development, at least for sort of liberal Judaism on the Seder plate, you will frequently go to a Seder in a liberal Reform Jewish house and find an orange sitting on the Seder plate. Have you encountered this?
I haven't. Tell me what that's about.
So it was only 20-something years ago, I think. Susanna Heschel, who's a rabbi, was reacting to the traditional sort of keeping away in Judaism of. It turned out it was of gay folks from within traditional Judaism and Jewish practice. And she said, they belong here with us, and so like we want to sort of mark their presence by putting something that usually isn't found traditionally, to sort of say, like we can innovate within the confines of the ritual, as it were. So the notion is right. For those who would think that certain kinds of people don't belong here, they're as unwelcome as an orange on a Seder plate. So she said, so we'll put the orange on the Seder plate,
right.
But which is a wonderful sort of modern midrash, as it were, but also sort of really works to demonstrate just how fluid the thing has been from where it began to where it is now.
Yes, so continued dynamism at least.
Right, which I think is really at the heart of most ritual. And I think is certainly central to the practice of Passover.
Let me ask you one more bread question.
Yeah.
In the biblical text, there's this sort of strong emphasis on the avoidance of leaven. But I think it's true, isn't it, that in the Seder, and is it beyond the Seder during the period of Passover, that to eat matzah is actually a positively enjoined thing, right? You should eat matzah.
You should eat it during the Seder itself, which again goes back to Exodus 12, where it says, when you sacrifice your lamb, you should eat it with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. After that, it's not so enjoined, not so required. But most people need to get their carbs one way or the other, and that's the best way we have for it.
Right, directly or indirectly. Yeah, other things made from it subsequently too. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.